92, and straight ahead in this hour, we'll continue our series this week on who killed JFK. This morning we focus on one of the more persistent of the assassination theories, the one that holds that the Cubans did.
Has stripped the Cuban people of their freedom.
We're back in Studio 3B on this Thursday morning. I'm Brian Gumbel, here with Katie Kirk and Joe Garagiola. Faith Daniels over at the news desk. She's going to bring us up to date in just a moment. This morning, as we continue our series, Who Killed JFK, we focus on the so-called Cuban connection. Anti-Castro Cubans in the United States certainly had a motive. They thought Kennedy was soft on communism and felt that he betrayed them in the Bay of Pigs fiasco. Castro himself had reason to want Kennedy out of the picture, too, because he'd heard about administration plans to hire underworld elements to assassinate him in Havana. But perhaps the most damaging indictment of Cuba's possible hand in the assassination came from Lyndon Johnson, who told close associates that he believed Castro had planned JFK's murder. Joseph Califano is a special White House assistant to LBJ. This morning he's at our NBC affiliate in Detroit, WDIV-TV. Mr. Califano, good morning.
Good morning, Brian.
Did you ever personally hear LBJ express this belief that Castro had a hand in it?
Yes, President Johnson said to me, Kennedy tried to get Castro, but Castro got Kennedy first. There was, in addition to the mafia connection, if you will, between the administration and in attempting to assassinate Castro, there was another operation run by the government, by the CIA and the Defense Department and the State Department, which was also attempting to assassinate Castro. And that was run by something called the Interdepartmental Cuban Committee at the time, led nominally by somebody from the State Department, but in fact by Robert Kennedy. And Johnson thought that that attempt to assassinate Castro had prompted Castro to attempt to kill John Kennedy. He thought Castro was involved in the Oswald assassination.
Now help me out on the timetable of this. LBJ knew about the administration attempts to kill Castro at the time they tried before the death, and how long after Kennedy's death did he express the opinion that it may have been the Cubans?
He stopped the attempts to assassinate Castro shortly after he became president. He talked to me in late 1966. In fact, in late 1966, President Johnson thought about reopening the Warren Commission report. We even thought about groups of people we might put on. We considered people like Barry Goldwater, Father Hesburgh out of Notre Dame, and others who might form another commission, but he decided not to do that, in part because he didn't want to hurt the Kennedy family, and in part because he didn't think it was in the country's interest at the time. I think the other thing that's important to note is, at the time the Kennedy administration was trying to assassinate Castro, and I don't believe I've ever said this before, but I think that, remember that Castro sent word back. I was a young aide in the Pentagon then. Castro sent word back saying, if you don't stop trying to kill me, I'm going to kill the president.
Let me come back to you in just a moment, Mr. Califano. Let me introduce James Johnston with me here in New York. He investigated the Cuban connection for the 75 Senate Select Committee on Assassinations. Mr. Johnston, good morning.
Morning.
What kind of circumstantial evidence did you find linking the Cubans in general, Castro in particular, with the assassination?
Well, Mr. Califano was talking about this plot to kill Castro. It was led by an agent, the CIA codenamed Amlash. He was a high-level Cuban. He wanted to lead a coup in Cuba, and he wanted to start with Castro's assassination. He told all of this to the CIA. Then Castro threatened retaliation right after this meeting.
He told this to the CIA, and he was looking for some kind of a signal that the CIA bought. You contend the signal came in a speech on the 18th, correct?
That's correct.
Let's take a look at that speech where JFK is speaking to some exiles, and this speech is in Florida.
It is important to restate what now divides Cuba from my country and from the other countries of this hemisphere. It is the fact that a small band of conspirators has stripped the Cuban people of their freedom. Once this barrier is removed, we will be ready and anxious to work with the Cuban people in pursuit of those progressive goals.
Okay, the trigger there was supposedly once this barrier is removed.
That's correct.
So they thought Amlash was going to do away with Castro.
That's correct.
But in fact, Amlash was what, a double agent?
He may have been. The CIA called him right after the speech and said, let's have a meeting. We're going to give you what you want. What he wanted was proof that Kennedy was behind it, and he wanted weapons. And they called him up and said that meeting's going to be on November 22nd. They met with him, gave him a copy of the New York Times text of that speech, said, we wrote it. Here's a poison pen to use for your self-defense, and we're going to get you rifles with telescopic sights. After the meeting broke up, they heard Kennedy was assassinated.
But the CIA was duped, you think?
They may well have been. They may well have been.
If we accept all of this and the Cuban connection, AMLASH, and everything else, how do Oswald Ruby fit into the scenario?
Well, Oswald's conduct becomes much more suspicious. He made this trip to Mexico City and spent 2 or 3 days there, but the Warren Commission could only account for about a day of his time when he was trying to get a visa to go to Cuba. Then he came back, moved his family from New Orleans to Dallas, lived apart from them, and then right after this Kennedy speech, Oswald went home and got his rifle where his wife was living and took it to the book depository. So he took no overt act to kill Kennedy until after the CIA had signaled to AMLASH that they were ready to go.
Okay, that doesn't bring in Jack Ruby at all. Help me.
Jack Ruby, we didn't look at that because you don't know whether his story was true. It doesn't help you find out what Oswald was going through Oswald's mind. He may have been to silence Oswald.
And one of the bizarre things is in your investigation, you actually found another assassin who never fired, but who fit the personality portrait of Oswald, who was supposed to do the deed 2 days earlier?
He was supposed to do the deed in Tampa when Kennedy appeared there, but when Kennedy was in Tampa on November 18th, the signal hadn't been given to AMLASH that the CIA was going to go with him.
Do you personally believe that the Cubans did it? I know you've got this massive body of evidence that leads you to believe it, but do you personally believe it?
I don't think anyone can ever know it with certainty. I mean, we don't have a provable case here. We have a high suspicion is what we have, and I think that's what President Johnson had.
Mr. Califano, if LBJ, as president, truly suspected the Cubans of their involvement in this and had some circumstantial evidence, why didn't he further pursue it? Why didn't he target Castro in particular or the Cubans who he may have suspected?
Well, I think he was so convinced that this was true, incidentally, that he asked the FBI for special protection for himself and his family because he thought Castro might attempt to assassinate him or his wife or children. Why didn't he pursue it? As I set out, I think clearly in my book on Johnson, The Triumph and Tragedy of Lyndon Johnson, he was concerned about reopening this whole thing for the Kennedy family. He was concerned about reopening it for the country. I think now, incidentally, that we really should open every single file there is, including all these CIA files on our attempts to eliminate Castro, and try and get as much as we can to the bottom of it.
Well, Mr. Johnston, you're one of the few people on this earth who has seen all of those files. Anything in them to suggest a smoking gun, a second gun?
I don't think anyone's seen all those files. I think Mr. Johnson's one of the most well-informed people, but I don't think anyone has seen all those files because I don't think anyone really understands what went on in 1963 inside the government.
We tried to see all the files. I mean, they may have been withheld or they may not be files, but the files we did see, there's no smoking gun there. It's going to basically tell the same story that the Warren Commission told. I think maybe if they're ever released, there'll be far more suspicions of a foreign conspiracy.
Gentlemen, as I thank you both, I'd also like to thank officials at the JFK Assassination Center in Dallas who have helped us throughout this series and lent us this model of Dealey Plaza and several other items. We are enormously grateful. Tomorrow morning, we're going to conclude our series on who killed JFK with the man who touched off all the current controversy, filmmaker Oliver Stone. Mr. Johnston, again, thank you. Mr. Califano in Detroit, thank you again, sir.
Thank you.
It's coming up on 8:21. We're back in a moment, right after this.
Okay.